So Keir Starmer has U-turned and will call a national inquiry into grooming gangs. The thing that forced his hand was the publication or the arrival of Louise Casey's audit into these crimes.
Rotherham, there was deliberate covering up, yes. I was going through a child's file and I realised somebody Tipp-Axed out the word Pakistani.
Now, the audit seems to have confirmed many things that we already knew. There's a disproportionate number of Pakistani men involved in these crimes, that actually the data collection is very poor, but where there is data, that's what it shows. It seems to have almost forced a lot of people, not just Keir Starmer, but many people among the Liberal establishment have had to say, I was always in favour of an inquiry. I've always cared about this issue. Let's start speaking openly and honestly. What have you made of first of all, the report and the reaction?
Well, I think the key word in words in what you were just saying there, Fraser, is what we already knew.
Yeah.
And that's what's just struck me listening to the news every day this week since this report came out, that there's nothing really new here. Anybody who's had an open mind on this issue for 20 years now, I mean, let's be honest, 2 decades, this has been in and around the news with various cases coming to court, pictures in newspapers of groups of men who've been arrested and imprisoned, details of the crimes that they've committed, and there've been various other local authority reports. This we have all known about this for years, and yet it's not just Keir Starmer who's suddenly miraculously, as if he's just heard about this for the very first time following Casey's review, but it's whole swathes of the media, of the commentariat as well, who, up until 2 minutes ago, we're going to write all of this off as a right-wing panic, as, jumping on a right-wing bandwagon, even to raise this issue.
Calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics.
And it's now, okay, so this report's been published, a very good report, has some really shocking things in it. Like there's one section where it talks about a denial, pages and pages on the denial that's gone on. And it's now like, oh, okay, suddenly we can admit that this is what's been going on. And not only that, we have to kind of backtrack and pretend that this was what we thought all along.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly deceitful. I mean, it's not just deceitful to the British public and a problem for democracy, but it's incredibly deceitful to the victims to say, well, we weren't going to take you seriously when it was just you who were coming forward saying this. We have to wait until we've had somebody from the House of Lords, come down and produce this official document. And it's only now that we're going to start taking this seriously. At least, Starmer could be honest and say, well, I did doubt this, or I wasn't prepared to go there. I wasn't going to stir up that hornet's nest. I wasn't going to potentially unpick the cult of multiculturalism that we've been building in this country for decades. I wasn't prepared to do that. But okay, now I've changed my mind and I am. Instead, you get this kind of denial even of the previous denialism, and it just sends your head spinning.
And there were so many sort of bogus arguments, when the sort of demands for an inquiry were being made. Partly one that was debunked pretty thoroughly in this report. There was this Home Office report in 2020 that said that, well, we don't have any data to confirm the ethnicity of the perpetrators, but we're pretty sure they're mostly white. There was that, which the Casey audit quite rightly says this is based on no evidence whatsoever, not on any research that can be backed up. There's also this line trotted out that we'd already had an inquiry, which was also nonsense because the child abuse inquiry, as sprawling as it was, didn't really cover the grooming gangs issue in any detail. But that line was trotted out. That denialism, that instinct to brush this under the carpet, it's just been a continuous feature of this.
Oh no, absolutely. And even now there's an attempt to do that. I think the way in which you've had politicians as well as the sort of liberal left media respond is to kind of skate over the question of ethnicity, the question of cover-up and so on, and then just go straight to, but she says we shouldn't politicise it.
Yeah.
Dame Casey says that we shouldn't politicise it, therefore those terrible Tories should stop making such a song and dance about it. Where were they for 14 years, etc., etc. It's not to say that the Tories don't have some questions to answer, given the fact that they're now somewhat ridiculously trying to take credit for an inquiry that they didn't even try, let alone fail to hold over the course of the time they were in power. That being said, that seems to be a deflection First of all, from the extent to which, as we'd already been talking about, this audit, although it probably didn't need to happen, it's useful that it has happened, has ripped to shreds the denialism of everyone in this, the way in which there was this attempt to suggest that there's clearly no disproportion or there's no questions to be answered there. I mean, as you were saying, Fraser, there's still a huge difficulty in trying to paint some kind of national picture, because there's I think it's 2/3 of actual police authorities just don't even record ethnicity data. But where there is that data, places like Greater Manchester, disproportion where child sexual exploitation is concerned is pretty clear. So according to their numbers, it was something like 50% of the perpetrators were from some sort of Asian background. It's believed to be predominantly Pakistani, whereas in Greater Manchester, they account for about 20% of the population. This is clear. This is stark. It's so obvious that that Home Office report from 2020 and the way in that was used to supposedly end the argument, that all of that was just nonsense. And so what people have had to do is just kind of try and change the subject.
Yeah.
Which I think is deeply unpleasant, not least because it wasn't that long ago that people were just flatly calling all of this a sort of racist conspiracy theory. I think the other reason the deflection is sort of shameless is because it does seem like the focus has become oddly on the Tories, when obviously this raises very direct questions about Labour. The towns in which this took place are Labour areas, Labour-run councils. Labour MPs started to change a bit in recent years because of how politics has mixed up a little bit, but nevertheless, these are places in which representatives of that party were clearly part of either turning a blind eye, refusing to acknowledge the evidence of their own eyes, or actively covering things up. And that's something which it becomes therefore particularly unpleasant to try and deflect onto the people who have actually been raising this issue for some time, rather than talk about the Labour Party and how their fingerprints are all over this. And I do think in a kind of crowded field, within time, particularly if this inquiry is worth its salt and actually really digs into those questions about what happened locally, who was involved and what have you, the grooming gangs, I'm pretty certain, will go down as like the greatest betrayal the Labour Party ever inflicted on their supposed heartlands, on working class, and in the case of the victims, very poor and vulnerable girls. The supposed party of social justice would happily throw the most vulnerable people in society under the bus if it meant polishing the reputation of multiculturalism, which they've picked every single time. So we can only hope that that's what will out, rather than all this nonsense kind of partisan bickering that's kicked off. It
is worth stressing that, the people in Labour who did raise this were also sidelined. Anne Cryer, MP for Keighley, was one of the first to raise this, was told in no uncertain terms that you'll be considered a racist.
Can you imagine what it felt like to have only parts of, not all of, but parts of the Muslim, the Pakistani community in Keighley saying that I was a racist because I was raising these very difficult issues? I'm not kidding you, it was very, very difficult.
Sarah Champion was sacked from Jeremy Corbyn's front bench for writing about this in the Sun newspaper. So even when good people have tried to make their voices heard, they've been come down on like a ton of bricks by the Labour machine.
No, absolutely. But just to reinforce the point Tom was making there about the continual denial, attempts at denial and obfuscation over this. I mean, the use of the word Asian men that we're seeing in all the press coverage is itself very, very slippery, because, these are not Chinese or Malaysian men. This is a very specific section of the Pakistani community. It's not even all Pakistani heritage men. It is one particular section of the Pakistani community. And it's places like Bradford, that have got a very, very high proportion of Pakistani heritage men who, and Bradford Council has refused point blank to hold an inquiry. And it is literally just in the past, I think, 24 hours that they've backtracked on that and agreed to hold an inquiry at long last. But I mean, the scale of abuse that could have taken place in Bradford, that's estimated to have taken place, again, extending over decades, it's just mind-boggling. And yet the refusal to even countenance this until 24 hours ago, I think at the moment we've got this kind of political blame game between Labour and the Tory party. But I really hope that when this proper inquiry gets underway, that there needs to be a whole layer of kind of police officers, social workers, teachers, people who were involved at a professional level, who were dealing with these girls, presumably the people who were running the children's homes. It's not good enough just to say, oh, well, this was what they wanted to do. They wanted to get out, or they absconded. Actually, if you're an adult and you're in charge of a children's home, you lock the door. If you think that there's a car outside with people who are potentially going to rape the girls inside your children's home, you lock the door and you say, no, you are not going out. And it just seems there's a real problem with adult authority in these areas. And yes, there's clearly political problems, but there's a whole layer of professionals who should have been responsible for these girls, who should have been working and protecting these girls, who utterly failed. And we all know why they failed, because they weren't prepared to they were more concerned about appearing to be racist than they were about protecting these vulnerable girls.
And there are so many other parallels in public life with that problem. I mean, when it comes to racism, of course, we had the Manchester Arena bombing where, one of the security people didn't want it, or someone working at the venue didn't want to intervene because he thought he would appear racist. I mean, how did the Tavistock scandal go on for so long? Because people were terrified of appearing transphobic. So time and again, you see political correctness allowing these absolutely grotesque things to happen in the name of making people appear good.
And this, again, is something that we've known for a very long time. I mean, report after report, the Telford report, the Rotherham report, the report in Oxfordshire, which came out many years ago, the picture is always the same, which is that police and local authorities held back from investigating this because they were worried about what it might do to race relations. I believe in the Telford report, although I might be mistaken, there was an explicit quote about they were worried a race riot might kick off, a real kind of low view of the white working class, but also the British Pakistani communities, if they wouldn't want to be involved in rooting out, child rapists in their own midst, because that might upset them culturally, is and its own kind of prejudice at play there as well. But you do have to wonder, like, what has happened to a society, to a state, to people who are charged with keeping law and order, with protecting the most vulnerable people in society and so on, where they're actually more afraid of being called names and of protecting children from serial abuse and exploitation. That's something which is, obviously we understand the trends that have gotten to this point, but that profound moral cowardice is something that people really have to be held for account to. We might understand how we got here, but it certainly doesn't excuse it in any way, which is why you hope that whether it's in the form of the inquiry or further investigations to come, that accountability properly happens. You don't have this fobbing off, which we've seen with some of the previous more localised reviews, which is this was a systemic problem and therefore we will do better next time. That's clearly not going to be good enough anymore.
I mean, it's a very minor point in comparison with the abuse of the girls, which is obviously the main thing here. But I do think there's that politically, we're seeing this kind of trend of people kind of denying what everybody in the public knows about and has known about for years. And then like something happens and immediately they turn around and pretend that they've known about this all along. I mean, it just seems a kind of bizarre thing to say, perhaps, but some interesting parallels with the situation in America with Biden, where absolutely everybody who had a pair of eyes could see that Biden's health was degrading before us. And yet the entirety of the White House team seemed to go into the defensive mode of, oh, no, he's absolutely okay.
And the media as well.
Yeah, and the media, everybody seemed to be kind of determined to push this one narrative. And then suddenly a book comes out which says, oh, actually, this was what was happening behind the scenes. And then it's like, oh, well, of course, we all knew this. Yeah. And it's like politics now seems to be in the game of kind of gaslighting the public. And I do think this is, like I say, in the grand scheme of everything that's going on now, it's not the most important thing. But I think it is storing up political problems down the line, because it just means you no longer trust a word that politicians, the media class, any of these people say anymore. And I think that really does sow up big problems for democracy.